Okay, good morning, and can I welcome members to the 21st meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2012. Can I remind members and those in the public gallery to ensure that all mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off at all times, not to silent but fully off. No apologies have been received for this morning's meeting. So the first item on this morning's agenda is to consider whether to take items 4 and 5 in private. Are members content to take agenda items 4 and 5 in private? Thank you very much. Can I move on to agenda item 2? Our second item is an evidence session this morning on cultural issues that the committee has decided to look at after the summer recess. And we have decided to start with how the establishment of cultural trusts has impacted on cultural services and delivery. This is the first of a series of one-off evidence sessions on culture issues. And at the end of those sessions, we'll be having evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs, Fiona Hislop. Can I welcome to the committee this morning Douglas Black, Regional Organiser with Unison. Good morning. Mark Rama, Assistant Chief Executive, Association for Public Service Excellence. Jerry Campbell, General Manager, South Lanarkshire Leisure and Culture. And Heather Stewart, Chair of the Voice of Chief Officers of Culture and Leisure Services in Scotland. Good morning to you all. Before I start the questioning, can I just remind the panel that, of course, we are delighted to have your views on all of the questions, but it's not necessary for all 4 of you to answer each of the questions, particularly if the answer already given is at least roughly in line with your own view. So that would be helpful if not everybody answers every question, if it's not necessary. Can I begin, though, with just a general question? Could I ask what the reason for establishing cultural trusts in the first place has been? A few years ago, no such things existed, and now they seem to be fairly widespread. So could I have a view on why councils have gone ahead and established such a number of cultural trusts over the last few years? Who wants to start? Douglas.
Quite happy. I mean, I think from our point of view and the evidence that we have, it's very clear that it's on the part of councils, it's an efficiency saving in as much as it's setting up these cultural trusts as a tax avoidance scheme in order not to be paying VAT and to get relief on non-domestic rates. So we're quite clear that it's tax avoidance is the primary reason for setting up these trusts rather than service delivery to the local community.
Mark?
I mean, the development of leisure and culture trusts was kind of from about the mid-1990s, and it was clearly as a result of budget pressures on sport, leisure and cultural services, and local authorities have taken advantage of that in terms of the reliefs that are available through business rates. And whilst there are other objectives to setting up leisure and culture trusts, I do agree with Douglas that one of the main advantages is the ability of local authorities in a way to use that to reduce the pressures on their budgets. That's been the primary driver behind the formation of leisure and culture trusts, although there are that's quite a general point, there are other reasons why councils have done it, but it's the main reason why local authorities have gone down that route.
Well, if there are other reasons other than, as you say, reasons of monetary efficiency, financial savings, what are they?
Well, most leisure, and I'm sure colleagues from South Lanarkshire and from Vocal will make that point as well, but most leisure and culture trusts are set up with community objectives and with objectives around increasing participation or wider social objectives. So there is an argument to be said that one of the reasons is to try and engage communities more effectively and to broaden the base for sport and recreation. It's an argument that's often put by Sporter and by leisure trusts. But I think in reality you have to look at this, that would local authorities have sought to set up leisure trusts on the scale that they have, and it's an increasing pressure on councils, had the pressures on revenue and capital for local authorities been the same. I think in APSI's view that's probably doubtful.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Heather.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on the points that have already been made, I mean, I do think we have to be realistic, and I think that's probably where we would agree that, you know, it's legitimate of local government, given the pressures that it is facing just now, right across its services, to look for ways in which it can deliver those potentially more efficiently and effectively, and I think there is evidence to demonstrate that that is the case. I think particularly there are challenges for culture and leisure within a local government budget process, for example, you know, competing with other obvious priorities which do not have the same scale of discretionary spend around them. For example, issues around child protection or schools, for example, that it is quite hard to make the case, again, even though there is lots of evidence, which was Mark's point about wider impact around health improvement and so on. But I do think that there is a genuine opportunity through looking at alternative delivery models, not just through trusts, to look therefore at how we can protect those services into the longer term to the benefit of communities. And I do think that these models can be set up in a way that's still very strongly linked to the democratic accountability of councils, and essentially as a way in which to deliver on the strategic priorities that they would have had, but with the financial savings, with the opportunity to protect those jobs and with an opportunity to protect those services. For example, one of the studies that was done down south, actually, by Wigan Arts and Leisure Trust, said that the other key advantage of trust status that they had found was the ability to generate investment for the library service. And I quote from it: "Money attracts money, and the ability to invest makes the service a major partner and able to attract other resources." Other national bodies like Museums and Galleries Scotland, who were perhaps later in seeing the potential for some of these alternative models, now have a toolkit to actually help local government assess whether that is the right model for their museums and galleries services, and that they do recognise now the increasing attractiveness of alternative delivery models within the sector. So I definitely think protection of services, protection of jobs and longer term investment into these services have got to also be the benefits. I'd have to say as well, flexibility of operation, often a smaller scale than a larger complex local authority organisation, a single focus often on one set of services where specialisms can be built up, and also that championing advocacy and additional skill set that comes with the strategic guidance of a board of directors.
There was an awful lot in there.
I know.
And I won't jump in. I'm sure everybody around the table will be desperate to cover a number of those areas as we go forward. So I won't come back on that just now. But just ask Jerry if he wants to.
Yeah, maybe just I think apart from the obvious financial advantages, my experience, first of all, I mean, I think I would say is Leisure Trust has been around for about 10 to 15 years. Cultural Trust perhaps a bit more recent. And in addition to the financial advantage, I would say that my experience is that when people are placed slightly removed from the local authority context into an arm's length organisation, there does appear to be, in my experience of it across Scotland, perhaps a slightly more entrepreneurial approach to actually how services can be delivered for the best, meeting the needs of the community. And I think that that's certainly one of the very obvious advantages, that if you actually engage and you actually talk to people who are actually running the services, they will say that they do feel perhaps there is a slightly less bureaucracy than there may well have been had they been part of the formal local authority setup. So perhaps a bit faster decision making, a bit closer to what's going on, but at the same time recognising that they're there to serve the needs. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence around that, and certainly in South Lanarkshire we've been doing a lot of work to try and quantify that around staff engagement.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you've given us a good opening. There's a lot of subjects in there, I'm sure, as I said, we'd like to cover and ask members to indicate when they want to jump in. But I'm going to start with Marco Biaggi.
Thank you. In talking there about the financial efficiency, there was a focus on the tax side. I hear from union representatives in my constituency concerns about potential gaps in remuneration of workers, working standards, and that sort of difference opening up as a financial incentive. Do you think that is a legitimate concern, and is that reflected through arm's length organisations across Scotland and elsewhere?
Yeah, certainly in my experience in South Lanarkshire, one of the commitments which the council made at the start when they were extending the model of the standalone sports trust to extend into cultural activities, the commitment was given that the terms and conditions of staff would continue to mirror those of the council. So where there are any significant changes, and there are some minor differences, but the significant changes around things like living wage and all sorts of other things which have gone on and been rolled out across Scotland, those have continued to be offered, and the terms and conditions have been protected by those who've gone in. And that's been a big, big issue for the staff, many of whom are at that front line delivering those services.
I mean, I would agree with Jerry that that's certainly the case in South Lanarkshire, and I would also say that that's the case in Falkirk Council, because they have a similar arrangement in terms of their community trust. However, that's not the general pattern across trusts that have previously been set up. As Jerry says, trusts have been on the go now for about 10 to 15 years, and these protections are certainly not in place in the majority of trusts. What we have seen in a lot of trusts is really the diminution of our members' terms and conditions, and in many cases wages as well, plus a huge casualisation of the workforce. And I think that's of real concern to us.
I concur with some of those comments as well. I think you can't generalise about every trust. I think the point about South Lanarkshire is an important one, but there are trusts that have had freedoms and flexibilities to set terms and conditions for staff, and I do concur with that point that there's been some casualisation within leisure, and some trusts have set their own terms and conditions, and that has not necessarily been to the advantage of staff within those organisations. But I think it's a mixed picture. Basically, you can't universally say that staff terms and conditions have been cut as a result of the formation of leisure trusts, but I think it depends. I could give examples of of trusts where that's taken place.
Please do.
Primarily in England. I mean, if you look at, for instance, some of the earlier trusts that were formed that have been competing for contracts, the kind of Leisure Limited, which is an Industrial and Providence Society, they put up contracts with other authorities. As they're contracts essentially. They've managed those just like contracts, and there has been an impact there in terms of staff terms and conditions. It's been the nature of the arrangement that they delivered. So there are kind of examples around of leisure trusts that have sought to do that. But equally, I think there are examples where authorities have insisted that those terms and conditions are maintained.
If I can just say quickly, I just think contextually as well, because all of those points have legitimacy, that there needs to be some thought given to whether some of the things that are actually developing post the transfer of services to trust would or wouldn't have actually taken place where those services to have been retained within councils. Local government are faced with the same challenges, if you like, as trusts in terms of efficiencies, service reductions, discontinuation of services, and also often potential changes in terms and conditions, be that around overtime or redundancy policies or whatever that might be.
With focus just as the last question on one particular aspect of employment policy that's been quite salient in political discussion, what is the status with arm's length cultural trusts and the living wage in Scotland generally? I mean, with the exception of the exemplars perhaps for good standards, is it the case that councils perhaps that have signed up to the living wage see the living wage promise stop before you reach the arm's length trusts, and that they're out with those commitments?
I think that would be the case unless the arrangement was in place as in South Lanarkshire and Falkirk, where there was the agreement that the trust would mirror the conditions of the local council. That's not the norm, I would have to say, in trusts up and down the country. So I suspect that the evidence would present itself as not picking up the living wage, even though the council had.
I think that might be one that would be worth actually doing some further analysis of, to be fair, because certainly the ones of which I'm aware, which would be represented through the vocal membership and so on, at the point of transfer of services, and often for long periods of time, 5, 6, 7 years, the terms and conditions are indeed broadly the same. The inflationary uplift in relation to pay and the associated terms and conditions for pay actually remain the same. And in some cases, councils have made a commitment where, for example, they've had a redundancy policy in place which has been about workforce planning and management, that those have been mirrored. And often there is a principle at the point of transfer of services that staff who are moving over will not generally, as a point of principle, face detriment. Clearly, you know, we're in challenging times, and every time a management of services agreement is renegotiated, these issues need to be looked at again. But often I think the sentiment is there.
Alpine?
Yes, it's really just to follow on from that point, if you could enlighten me as to whether these trusts are subject to European procurement law.
I answer that. It depends, basically. Leisure services are Part B services under EU procurement, so they're not subject to the full EU procurement regime, but Part B services, by and large, have to follow the requirements of EU procurement. Most leisure trusts are set up as grant and lease arrangements, so they get an annual grant from the council, they have a long-term lease in place. Where that's clear and explicit, it is not subject to EU procurement, but there are a number of trusts where it's not at all clear, particularly that were set up a number of years ago, where they're effectively contracts. And if they are contracts, then they will be subject to EU procurement. And I think that is an issue for some leisure trusts, particularly where leisure trusts are now coming up to the ending of the initial 10-year period of contracts or agreements, that they need to have a look at that. If it's effectively a contract with the authority, and there are tests about what constitutes a contract, then it's potentially subject to EU procurement and may need to be subject to competition.
Right.
It depends how it's set up.
So basically, it depends how it's set up. So
Yeah.
if these were coming up for renewal, then you could move to an arrangement where they weren't subject to EU procurement rules.
Yeah, authorities would need to take detailed legal advice on that, because you cannot deliberately try to avoid the implications of EU procurement or state aid. But there are issues around the way some of the, you know, some issues in relation to. I mean, most leisure trusts get an annual grant, and there are limits to what conditions you can apply to an annual grant. Within the contractual arrangement, you can enforce much more with the provider of that service. So there are tests as to what constitutes a contract, but there are a number of authorities, I'm not sure about in Scotland, but there are certainly in England a number of authorities now that are falling foul of this and having to consider, as some of these arrangements come to their natural expiry date, as to whether they need to subject any future arrangements to some form of competition. As I say, the Part B services, and whilst there is clearly a private sector provision within England and Scotland, it's not extensive within local authorities. I suppose there are issues around risk as to whether, you know, there is a wider European context to this, but it's certainly an issue that's very high on the agenda for many local authorities that I know of.
One of the things that we are very aware of through our members, and which was borne out through the survey work that Vocal did, is that there is an increasing analysis and an increasing trend towards a particular model which actually resolves and simplifies quite a lot of those issues. And there are two drivers for that. One is procurement and state aid, and one is governance and accountability, and direct link back to the democratic accountability and strategic direction setting of the council. And that is that increasingly the trust model is set up with a single model within the company, where that single member of the company is in fact the council. So clearly that means in practical terms that well, from a procurement perspective, what that means is that where work has been awarded to an arm's length organisation, in reality and in terms of procurement and state aid law, it is deemed to be part of the body commissioning that work. So it means that it's required to meet all of the same procurement and state aid rules as the council, and it also means that it's not vulnerable to legal challenge. But clearly what it also does is to clarify and strengthen some of the concerns that there are out there about a lack of governance and accountability that would be sufficiently robust as is there within the council.
Just to follow on from that, how does that affect part of the reason that was given at the beginning was the financial savings, such as the VAT savings and all the charitable status, etc. How does that sit then if it's in that model? I mean, surely that wouldn't meet the rules on charitable status.
What it does is it meets the rules in terms of procurement and state aid. But what it also still allows is for the company limited by guarantee with the council as a sole member to apply for charitable status, and there are sole member companies out there and that have been established, so it can still be a charitable status, have charitable status, and it can still apply for, if it works out best for it, for VAT exemption or for partial kind of VAT exemption.
I think there are a number of authorities that are looking at this kind of I know, for instance, Wolverhampton City Council at the moment are looking at a similar kind of arrangement. Local authorities can still grant discretionary relief to these bodies, even if whether they've got charitable status or not. It's just that the financial benefits are not as clear as if it's an independent, separate corporate body like an Industrial and Provident Society or a company limited by guarantee. But local authorities can still grant some discretionary relief. It's just that they wouldn't get the full mandatory relief in terms of business rates. I'm not sure about the VAT benefits.
Well, they do get full non-domestic rates. I think relief on the properties that then form part of the lease arrangements and property agreement with the new trust. Here, the additional issue in relation to VAT is that quite a lot of the admissions charges that would be charged for cultural services, you can apply for a cultural exemption. So essentially you don't need to charge VAT on those. What comes with that then is a sort of quid pro quo, which you can't then reclaim all of the VAT. So the formula that you would always then look at is the kind of cost benefit of that. But in most cases, going for that VAT exemption is actually much more cost effective, and that's where the kind of perception comes in terms of the VAT savings.
It's complicated.
It is.
To say the least. I'll move on. Liz Smith.
Good morning. Could I possibly ask 2 questions? Firstly, do you get any direction from local authorities that there is one particular model that is favoured for cultural trusts? And secondly, how would you go about measuring the success of these cultural trusts?
I think the cultural trust model is relatively new in Scotland, and so I think that local authorities across Scotland at 32, are talking to each other about, different approaches, and Heather's just been making reference to this whole issue of procurement, the sole member, how the board, how you select, etc. So I think that's pretty much in its infancy. My experience is that when South Lanarkshire were looking at what was happening in the established sport model, the view there are there aspects of this that could be tailored to bring in and work with cultural facilities within what was an existing arrangement. So the board, the governance, all the accountability, all the kind of issues around the quantitative, the performance management, and all these things. And in South Lanarkshire, the model has been established now for 18 months, and there have been some changes, but on the whole, it's pretty much as it was, with these additional services having been brought in. Now, obviously, in other areas in Scotland, it's completely it's a standalone organisations that have been established. But I think that certainly my experience, and we have had 5 or 6 councils in Scotland talking to us in South Lanarkshire over the last few months about whether or not you should establish a separate or whether there's options for integration. And our view would be, and I can obviously talk from the South Lanarkshire model, is that the integration into what's there at the moment seems to work well, as opposed to duplicating many of the other issues that we've just been hearing around procurement and governance and everything else.
Right.
I would make the point. The 2 most common models of trust are a charitable trust, which is a company limited by guarantee, and it's a facility-based approach, or an Industrial and Provident Society, which is a community benefit company, not a staff-owned mutual, because it wouldn't get the advantages that a leisure trust would get. The leisure and cultural trusts are a pretty new phenomenon. There are a number of quite large ones, and local authorities have looked at going beyond purely facility-based approach, or adding community facilities, libraries, museums, parks and open spaces have been included. Wigan Leisure Culture Trust was mentioned. I think there are a couple of authorities in Scotland that have got parks and open spaces included within leisure trusts. The reasons for doing that, I wouldn't say that was universally true of all leisure trusts. There are no financial benefits to an authority for including parks, because all the financial advantages to local authorities around trusts are based around around facilities, essentially. But there are a number of authorities now increasingly starting to look at that as an approach. Whether it's the right approach for an individual council, I think, really depends upon what the business case says. I'll just make one other observation in terms of the measurement of performance. I think there's a clear issue. I mentioned Covina as well. I just wanted to put on record that there was a piece in the Scotsman this morning that I think I was slightly misquoted in terms of just saying that trusts, it seemed to imply that I was saying that trusts out, because of the financial advantages, it was better than in-house provision. The business rate advantage is a clear financial advantage for a leisure trust. But there are no clear, I don't think there's any clear evidence that trusts perform better than other forms of service provision. If you look at our performance networks data, and I'm using usage as one proxy, there are other measures you can use, but there's nothing that suggests that trusts outperform in-house provision in terms of usage and throughput or participation. It very much depends. You'll still find in areas of Scotland, you know, there's high subsidy in areas where there are high levels of deprivation, but still low levels of usage, and vice versa. So the pattern depends. And I do think there's an issue about how you measure performance, because there should be a clear link between the public subsidy for leisure and health or social outcomes. And I think that's a weak area. And it's been identified by Audit Scotland. It's not in every authority. Some authorities are very, very good at making those links. But it's certainly something that needs to be addressed, because that's the whole point of public subsidy for leisure, to achieve wider social outcomes.
Is there a danger in that, because you're pointing out, and Mr Black said that the same in his opening remarks, that it is very much the financial driver that is the reason behind trusts? Is there a danger that it then becomes rather difficult to particularly measure some of the qualitative values of how trusts may help a local community? You can obviously measure participation, and it's a numerical figure, or you can measure the benefit of cost savings and another numerical figure. But actually, in terms of the qualitative values, is there a danger that we sort of overlook that a little bit and don't actually look at what benefits a community could have through the trust, as opposed to provision by a local authority in the normal way?
I'm sure Heather will want to come in on this as well, but I think there is a danger. I think there are ways of addressing that. But there is a clear danger, because if you reduce the public subsidy for leisure, it means that the organisations that you set up need to become much more commercially focused, or they need to look at service rationalisation. So unless you get that balance right, and unless there are kind of clear arrangements for the monitored performance and targets that are linked to what the objectives are of the local authority, then there is a danger that that will happen. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed, because it's not clear across all leisure trusts that applies.
I mean, I think what I would say is the danger isn't any greater than those services being delivered within local authority at this moment in time. Particularly in terms of links right back up to the single outcome agreement, links in terms of evidencing wider impact and so on. And in fact, you might argue, if you saw some of these tomes of contracts for services, which are getting increasingly sophisticated because of all of the issues that are getting talked about today, because they need to be, that actually, you know, what you could look at a service plan for culture or leisure in a local authority, whatever were the key performance indicators in there, the key outcomes that were important to elected members in local authorities there, those will inevitably become what the trust is actually asked to deliver. What you might do is introduce others which help to do some of those things about actually where there improved efficiencies, you know, have the income generating potential, has that increased, for example. But you can normally see an absolute read across, and at the end of the day, we shouldn't forget that local authorities are reliant then on the trusts to deliver on what are the statutory performance indicators that are required to deliver to the Accounts Commission. So there must be that read across.
Sorry, I know I'm hogging this slightly. It's just another point I think it's worth making as well. And I go back to the Audit Scotland report that came out in 2010 that identified the issue around measuring performance and clear outcomes as being one of the issues. And I would say, you know, APSI benchmark sport and leisure facilities. We've over 500 facilities within our model. And I do think there's an important issue here about local authorities ensuring that they compare their performance effectively and report on that performance, not only at a national level but at a local level, you know, in terms of accountability to elected members and communities.
Just the last point I would make, given the pressures that local authorities are undoubtedly under, and particularly on a financial basis, could it be argued that trusts might have the benefit of being able to focus on specific issues more than a local authority might do, because they've got so many other things to do?
Very much so. And I think in terms of setting out clear objectives, being very, very clear and articulate about how they wish to see the performance being monitored and fed back. I would say that in South Lanarkshire, the model that we now have, there is a significantly increased degree of monitoring going on about the performance, both quantitative and qualitative, than was previously the case. And I think probably like many people, when you're managing a service, you kind of look at it and think you'd like to make some changes, then you get the opportunity to stop the bus, make the change and put something different in place, and then it's managed in a different way, and that's certainly the experience that we have.
Liam MacArthur.
I think in relation to an earlier question, you suggested that one of the benefits, I mean, obviously I think it's accepted that there's a financial driver behind this trend, but actually one of the advantages you saw was perhaps an unlocking of a certain kind of entrepreneurial spirit, if you like. I mean, based on what Mr. Bramas told us about the suggestion of, in relation to performance and no real indication of how performance is improved through trust, I mean, that would tend to contradict your suggestion that South Lanarkshire, it's not necessarily across the board. In certain instances, you've seen entrepreneurship kind of flourish in a way that hadn't been previously. Is there any evidence you can give that would perhaps?
Well, yeah, absolutely, and I know it's different in different areas. And I can obviously only talk for my experience, but also, you know, I mean, I'm also a member of Sporta, the Leisure Trust organisation within the UK. My experience, well, first of all, a little bit, just a couple of minutes just to explain a little bit of background. When the transition was going through and people were being advised they were going to transfer from the employment of the council into the expanded organisation, the clear condition, the clear concern that in going back that people had, what's going to happen about my terms and conditions? Am I going to have inferior terms and conditions that are going to be the same? I took the time to go around all of the areas, visited every library and went to as many of the regional halls and cultural facilities, and first of all assured staff it was going to be the terms and conditions were not going to be inferior to those that they currently had. Not that they were great to start with, but they wouldn't be any different. So that was a kind of great, people would say it was a great kind of weight off the shoulders. The next thing we then said to people, look, we're not asking people to do things radically different, but we are going to try and ask for a little bit more of a stretch around integration and promoting other services. And again, you could argue that when people were employed and they were in the council, why weren't they doing these things? Well, I don't know, I wasn't managing them. Now we are. We've got them in, and my experience would be that we now have people, when you walk into a library, for example, we have 25 libraries in South Lanarkshire, people will, in addition to serving and providing information, will openly talk about other aspects and promoting services. Now, we have 1,200 staff, and if I have that approach from 1,200 staff in 165 locations across South Lanarkshire, that's very, very good for the promotion and the ongoing view of services. The other key factor and piece of evidence I would give you is that at the time of transfer, absence levels amongst the staff that were transferred were probably 5% or above. And in the 18 months that we've transferred staff in, we have an absence rate of 3.4%, which would hold its own in the private sector, and is certainly up there with some of the very best levels which exist within the public sector. So I think those are two areas where I would see, and the other, probably the final thing is to say, when we ask staff engagement, we've spent quite a lot of time, and we've asked people what they actually feel, and people feel a little bit more empowered. We're working with the same budgets, it's not radically different, but people generally just feel that in a smaller organisation, 1,200 people as opposed to 15,000 people in the council, and they do feel a little bit more involved just in their own destiny. That's the example.
And is that reflected in service user feedback as well? Or?
Yeah, well, we measure customer satisfaction. There's been some small increases in usage of libraries and cultural facilities. It was already a well-run service, and we have obviously in South Lanarkshire used that and used the fantastic experience there to try and just tinker with some of the issues. We're only 18 months into it. Probably a question I'd like to be asked 5 years from now, but certainly at the moment we're seeing some small increases in terms of how the service is performing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really recognise the entrepreneurial spirit that leisure trusts have suddenly created, I have to say, because, I mean, a lot of the issues that Jerry has identified regarding absence management, decentralisation, these are issues that the council, that local authorities have been putting in place and running for many, many years. Decentralisation has been on the go in local authorities for the last 15, 20 years. So it's nothing new to look at services being delivered in single locations, whether that be libraries, whether it be housing services or social work services. That's a common model in local authorities and has been for a long time. One of the issues that we have found in many leisure trusts is that when they've first been established, that the business cases have not been robust enough. and that we have to question some of the costs, the set-up costs, that have meant, in some instances, leisure trusts not performing as well as they should have performed, or not performing to the expectations that the council had at the time that that leisure trust was set up. So I think there are real concerns about that. But in terms of some of the issues that Jerry is saying that leisure trust has improved, I'm afraid I don't recognise that, because these are issues that local authorities have improved upon year on year to the level that they're comparable with any other public sector body or the private sector.
Just to quote the Audit Commission, obviously English Audit Commission, but I think it backs up what Audit Scotland have said. Their report in 2007 said, no single management option delivers the best overall value for money or consistently results in more investment or higher levels of participation. I do recognise some of the points that Jerry made about what's happening in South Lanarkshire, but I concur with Douglas. I think from APSI's point of view, that's about the way in which services are organised, managed and led, and there is nothing unique. We've just produced, whilst it doesn't relate to particularly to sport and leisure, there are examples within that. We've just produced a piece of research on municipal entrepreneurialism, which looks at 10 or 11 case studies of how local authorities have been innovative, delivered entrepreneurial services. So it's entirely conceivable it can happen within a local authority without, you know, an arm's length organisation, but that's down to management and leadership of that organisation and the way in which staff are engaged within it.
Can I just check one thing? Mr Campbell, are you really saying that the move from a local authority control to a trust control makes people healthier?
Very much so. That's my. I can only obviously talk for the example in South Lanarkshire. Healthier sport, physical activity, engagement in cultural activities, attending arts classes, whatever. It's one part, one contribution to obviously people making life changes, and there's things reported and case studies in the media, etc. all the time about this. Certainly, I think that what we do and the partners we work with, the feedback that we receive from people who use the services that we provide on behalf of South Lanarkshire, I think that we make a positive contribution to people feeling mentally well, better, physically better, and well at the same time.
Sorry, it wasn't actually the users of the services I was asking about.
Sorry.
You said that the staff absence rate had dropped from over 5% to around 3.4%.
Yes.
I was just wondering, what it is that would cause that, moving from being under local authority control to a trust control. You said yourself it's effectively the same organisation in the same places with the same staff. So
yeah, well, I think we're a smaller organisation than the council. I gave you the two comparators, 15,000 staff. I think it's a big organisation, big to manage the change. We're a smaller organisation. We're probably a bit tighter and closer to the staff in terms of communications. We work very, very hard at that. And I can only then, give you information. People will say that their levels of morale and attendance and commitment seem to be slightly higher than they were when they were employed in the council, and that's evidenced by the fact that the staff absence levels have improved to a very good level, and that's our experience.
Mr Black, do you find that's the case across your members, not particularly South Lanarkshire, but in general?
I was going to say, but I wouldn't want to comment specifically in South Lanarkshire, but no, I don't think that is the case. One, I don't know about the absence management procedures that South Lanarkshire have in place, for instance, as to whether they're draconian, as to whether they're not, or whatever. But I think the morale with staff generally in leisure trusts, as far as speaking to our members and our stewards in these areas, is probably quite the opposite, is that morale's not particularly good within trusts. They do see a programme of service closures, and I'm not saying this happens in every trust, but libraries are a classic example, particularly if you take Falkirk, for example, a recently established trust where, some 6 months into the trust, the opening hours of the libraries were slashed. Now, that's of real concern not only to members of staff, but it's of real concern to the community as well. Other trusts, you see terms and conditions being cut. quite severely in some cases. So I don't think morale. You can say that moving into a leisure trust has improved morale. That certainly won't be the experience up and down the country. Maybe in South Lanarkshire, but it won't be a general theme.
Want to make a brief comment?
Just a brief comment. I mean, I hear all of that, and I suppose all I would say is what we need to understand is what are the drivers for some of the things that are being said. Is it the reduction in the amount of resources available to local authorities to deliver culture and leisure services, or is it purely associated with the change to the delivery model? Certainly our experience within local government is that these cuts are coming, and these cuts need to be made, and they are having an impact on culture and leisure services, as they are indeed with all other services. And I just think it's important not to imply that they are happening because of the move to trust.
Neil Bibby.
Maybe just come in on that.
On this point.
Yes, just very briefly. Do you think having the arm's length structure makes these services more susceptible when councillors are meeting to decide where cuts fall?
No, I don't. That wouldn't be my impression. I don't think it makes it any easier or any more difficult. I do think that where at the moment you have local authorities who very clearly have culture and/or leisure as a political priority, that doesn't appear to me, looking across local authorities, to be impacted upon in terms of decisions to make the move to trust. In fact, in those authorities that I've worked within and that I'm aware of, sometimes the big driver, as I said right at the beginning, is often to secure the future for these services, not just because of the financial savings, but because some of the other comments that have been made about creativity and innovation. And there is evidence of that. And I mean, if I can just say, at the moment, I'm in the sort of interesting position of having done sort of 4 or 5 years at Perth and Kinross as a kind of head of service in local authority. And for the past four weeks, I've been concentrating on setting up a cultural trust, a new cultural trust in Fife that needs to be delivered by the 1st of October. So I'm right in the middle of all of this. And again, a bit like Jerry, I can only quote from my personal experience. I'm going around all the facilities. Staff have been through a period of real uncertainty, but actually now we're really starting to talk about the opportunity, and through appropriate encouragement are starting to come up with things that, again, it was a strong service, but there were things that will be more flexible and easier for them to deliver, that will be to the benefit of service users than has been the case previously. And they have evidence of that because they've asked for things to happen. It's not been as easy to deliver. There's been a competing priority. So there's an opportunity there, but it's horses for courses. And I do agree with the point about there shouldn't be a leap into the trust model. There needs to be a proper sort of options appraisal that reflects the tailored specific circumstance of a local authority, the political priorities and the cost benefit of doing so.
Could I make one observation on that? I
mean, only for very quick, Mr. Brown.
The pressures on local authority budgets will make local authorities look at the trust option in terms of the financial advantages. So there's that element of it. And I do think that, you know, removed from the council, that, you know, local authorities, it's an annual grant, and local authorities tend to review that. I'm not just saying in terms of leisure trust, but the link with the council over time diminishes. It's a natural progression. So yes, I think there is an element of, you know, that kind of political input into leisure diminishes. And we've, as I said, the research we've found in England has shown that.
Thank you very much. Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. We've heard this morning about differences between cultural trusts, differences in terms of workers' pay and conditions, customer satisfaction. I just wondered if you could, obviously there's been a lot of focus on what the differences are. I wonder if you could surmise what you think the common benchmarks should be of performance in terms of cultural trusts, what they are currently, what they should be, and how this would be best achieved.
I mean, I think I covered some of this a little bit in an earlier answer. I mean, at the moment, the performance frameworks associated with cultural services tend to be around, at their core, the statutory performance indicators in terms of numbers of users of museums or library services per 1,000 of the population, for example, book borrowing in relation to libraries, internet access, a whole range of things. And I think that all of the things that are currently used by local government to assess the effectiveness of their cultural services need to be carried across into trust. I do agree with the comment earlier that perhaps it provides an opportunity to look more creatively at these performance measures and to think about how we might actually build in some of the more qualitative measures. But again, some of that's already started to happen in local authorities and may already be there and be easier to shift across. I do think it also makes sense to do the comparative trends, obviously, in performance prior to trust and obviously post the move to trust as well, so that you can get a sense of, you know, whether there have been the efficiencies or the improvements in performance that you intended. I also think it's important that there is a consistent and comparable way to measure the quality of both culture and leisure services across Scotland. And one of the things that I think has worked against culture and leisure services is not having an equivalent inspection regime, for example, in relation to the How Good Is Our School model or How Good Is Our Community Learning and Development. And one of the things that Vocal's been doing in working with Education Scotland and COSLA, for example, is to develop the How Good Is Our Culture and Sport model. Now, I think irrespective of where those delivery of services is happening, that's something that we can roll out and will start to give us more meaningful benchmarking information, which ultimately is driven by real good quality validated self-assessment, which means that you are taking account not just of their kind of strategic leadership, but also the quality of your frontline service delivery and what the focus of areas improvement should be going forward.
I think that from APSI's perspective, it's back to my point about the public subsidy for sport and leisure. That public subsidy pays for whether it's health outcomes or wider community outcomes. And if there are going to be performance measures, there needs to be some clear links between public taxpayer money that goes into leisure and achieving those outcomes. And I think, you know, whether it's addressing issues like obesity, whether it's, active participation in sport from children, whether it's links to disadvantaged communities or ethnic minorities, those are the kind of key outcomes that should be linked to. I think there's an operational set of measures as well in terms of facility management. You know, we benchmark an awful lot of performance data about the performance of individual centres, but I think that's the important dimension in terms of public sport, leisure and culture, that we need to kind of make a link between the public money that is being put into that area and what outcomes are being achieved at a higher level. And I think that is made in some authorities, but it could be, you know, we could be a lot better at that, basically.
I think I would agree with Mark there regarding the public money issue, because we've already heard that trusts are set up on the basis where they should be democratically accountable. And I would agree with that. They should be democratically accountable. They should also feature within the local authorities' priorities for that particular area, and that comes back to the political choices that are made. However, in saying all that, I'm not sure the model is right to be able to monitor that and be able to best work out whether in fact the delivered outcomes are in fact being delivered properly, and I think that's a concern.
I guess my follow-up question would be, I think we would all agree that for public money we want to get the best possible outcomes, and I know it's been talked about this morning, talked about regularly beforehand, is about the democratic accountability issues. How can the democratic accountability of cultural trusts be improved, and what benefits would that provide in terms of performance?
My view would be to have sports museums and leisure delivered directly by a local authority. However, the model that has been set up in order for leisure trusts to achieve the financial savings that they can do means that locally elected members will not form the majority of any board within a leisure trust or a cultural trust. So whilst you have local authority members or a member on the board, they do fulfil a different role from that of a councillor within a local authority. They fulfil a role as a board member of that particular trust, along with the responsibilities that come with that role. So I think there is, I think there is an issue where we have locally elected members on the board, but their role in terms of being democratically accountable for the decisions that are made is very much watered down and understated.
I think, can I say a couple of things on accountability? First of all, in South Lanarkshire, we're trying to make sure that the make-up of the board reflects the services which are provided to the local community. So we need to have strong, experienced people on the board who can articulate and take on board issues that they may be receiving from staff or from customers about the kind of range of services that we're providing. That's the first thing. The next thing, I think, is that people increasingly, customers that are using the facilities, are increasingly aware and astute at how they can actually provide you with feedback, whether it's through social media or comments, or actually just calling you and letting you know what we actually think about the services. And the third thing is just the straightforward quantitative data, which is there at the moment, which is that if more people are using your services, not to be complacent, but if more people are using your services, then and engaging with them, people are very, very able to tell you whether or not they believe the services are the right ones, and but whether or not, in their views, you're being accountable for the money which you're investing within the local area.
Again, one, I suppose the obvious point to make, and it refers back to the Audit Scotland report in 2010, but I make no views about whether it's the right model for a local authority, but if you have a leisure and culture trust, the key bit to me, because of potential conflicts of interest, if you've got councils on the board, then local authorities need to strengthen the governance, scrutiny and transparency arrangements that relate to leisure and culture trusts. And there are a number of ways that that can be done when these organisations are set up, because there are a number of ways local authorities can influence that, whether that's through the funding mechanism, whether it's through the founding documents of the trust, the performance frameworks that are set up. But I think local authorities need to take their scrutiny and governance role more seriously in relation to leisure trusts. And that's an area, by the way, that applies to any arm's length organisation that a local authority sets up. I think there are weaknesses in that kind of corporate and political governance of some of those organisations at times.
Time moving on, so can I have short questions, and I remind the panel of the not absolute necessity for everybody to answer every question, and could have short answers. So I'll begin with Mark Obiagi and then Liam MacArthur.
This one might even be answerable with a yes or a no. Are these organisations subject to FOI?
Depends on the model, sorry. With a sole member, absolutely, unquestionably. As independent organisations, by default, because a lot of the information that is transferring between an independent arm's length organisation and the council would be covered by the council's FOI duty, is my understanding.
Yeah, not as corporate models, but there are proposed changes to FOI which I understand may bring them within some of the requirements.
Just interested in the issue of accountability. I mean, if you're an elected member and you're sitting on a leisure trust board, and that leisure trust is not felt to be delivering, then you will be held accountable by your electorate at the next election. And if you are not on a leisure trust board, but you are part of the administration within the council, and that leisure trust is not delivering for the service users, then you will be held accountable by your electorate. So I'm just wondering where that lack of accountability is felt to exist, whether the service is delivered by a trust or directly through the local authority.
The problem for members sitting on trust boards is their responsibilities are to that corporate body, whether it's an industrial providence society.
Doesn't really care about that.
I know that, but in strict legal terms, they've got a duty to that body. That's why they're put on that body. And that creates a kind of problem, I think, for elected members. And I think that one of the issues on the kind of the authority side of things is that there needs to be an increase, an overview and scrutiny of arm's length organisations, across local authorities.
Thank you, Convener. It's just to dig a wee bit deeper into the relationship between the council in relation to this sort of democratic responsibility. There's mentioned a lot of the advantages, as you see them, of a cultural trust, and that the board can have different members drawn from different areas of business and the community, and there's an entrepreneurial spirit and all the rest of it. But the danger is, at the end of the day, if it's created, that it ends up being a finance issue and a finance committee for the council point of view. And if for instance, the charitable status changed or the financial advantages changed, do you think the councils would still maintain the cultural trust based on these less sort of financial issues, or do you think there is a real benefit in having that additional expertise available and the structure there?
Well, in South Lanarkshire, to give you a kind of financial value first of all, and kind of think how this sits, the annual saving is about £2.6 million. If that wasn't there, I think the council, my experience would be, despite the fact it's been established for the last 10 years, the council would look very closely at whether or not it wished to continue with the model if the financial advantages weren't there. I would hope, in terms of what we've achieved over the last few years, the engagement and all of the other associated advantages, that there would be clear issues about continuing with it. But I understand that the driver initially was one of finance. And I'm sure elected members would wish to review that decision if the annual saving wasn't there.
I mean, ultimately, I think it's about, in all of the things that it's delivering, the council is obviously fulfilling its duty of best value, which is not just the lowest cost option, and that applies whatever kind of commissioning or contracting relationships it's putting in place. I mean, the one observation I would make is that although we've got a focus on local authorities and the trust model, quite a lot of the challenges that we've got around these that are being talked about today are no different to the arrangements that we've got at national level in terms of the relationship between central government, for example, and the National Museum or the National Library or some of these other cultural bodies that they fund. Some of the same tensions are there with the NDPBs.
I think the fallback position is always going to be the local authority, whether that be a situation of a trust failing, or whether that be a situation of the financial exemptions, that route being blocked off, or whatever. So I think the local authority will always be the body where that falls back on. And if that happens for whatever reason, the local authority clearly then has to determine how or if it delivers these services in the future and what their priorities would be.
I agree with Jerry's point. I think the decision about continuing with the trust, if the financial advantages were not there, may be down then. It may be a local political decision. It may be down to other organisational factors, but it certainly would diminish the reasons local authorities were involved in leisure trusts.
Jean Urquhart.
You'd be pleased to know that quite a lot of the supplementary questions kind of covered, because my question really was about local authority, the relationship and the governance and the accountability. But just I would quite like to ask a couple of questions. The cost of the governance, I think, is an issue, and also if the chief executive of any of these trusts showed that it would be within budget and the job that he was doing was much more important, and he decided to pay himself or herself another $25,000 a year, and everybody was in agreement with that, that would be fine. That's possible.
No, not in South Lanarkshire, unfortunately. But if you've got a model, I'd be happy to take that away. But no, that's not the case. At the start I said we'd mirror terms and conditions, and therefore for the senior staff, the general manager and all staff, again, we've mirrored the terms and conditions and the arrangements for performance and review, those which exist within the council, and so the board and that just couldn't happen.
We also had, I think, in the early days, possibly the first arm's length organisation for arts and culture was in Glasgow, where I think initially the board members were paid. Is that a practice that's ended now?
Yes, I understand that to be certainly the case in Glasgow, and all of the trusts that I'm aware, board members would be reasonably incurred expenses only. They are not paid.
Mm-hmm. And I think there is an issue that we've probably heard about the accountability of local authorities, and I know just from my own experience too that it can happen that when the local authority decides to issue a contract to an arm's length organisation, it actually stops having quite such a direct link with developments that are happening. And what is the advice, or what is the feeling in the arm's length in terms of going back to the local authority to say, instead of a monthly or a 6 weekly report that would come from officers on all of these services. That's no longer there. Therefore, in councils that are quite big, I mean, in Highland Council, for example, there's 80 members, but there are only three members on the board of the arm's length organisation. So where do you see how do you think that should be?
Well, I think there are three levels of that. You know, in setting up what are increasingly robust contracts, you need somebody who's actually an expert in contract monitoring to hold the trust to account around actually what's there to be delivered. But that's very quantitative side of things. I think the second thing that you need is a well-functioning relationship between the chief executive and senior team of the trust and senior officers with related responsibilities or client monitoring responsibilities in the council. And in terms of the democratic accountability, depending on the committee model that you've got, I personally strongly feel that you need some kind of committee or subcommittee model where regularly the chief executive, perhaps some members of the board, are given the opportunity to both showcase the work of the trust and to give performance information, but actually also to be held accountable for public money. I think with those three things in place, in lots of cases, you would actually have a much more robust scrutiny and monitoring framework in place than you perhaps do for the services when they're in-house.
I think it depends on how you treat the arm's length organisation. I make no judgments about, again, whether it's the right or wrong thing to do, but if you treat them as contractors, they'll behave like contractors. If you treat them as partners, and I think there's a very valid point about engaging the managing director or the chief executive of the trust, whether an effective member of the council senior management team, but they need to be involved not just as the provider arm, but as part of the kind of commissioning approach of the local authority. So I think there's a strong case to engage them at that level.
I think I would agree with everything that Heather said up until about the last sentence when she stated that local authorities might not provide that democratic control that she was suggesting. I don't think that's the case at all, because I think the very nature of local authorities mean that democratic control over an in-house service is absolutely fundamental.
I would just say the model in South Lanarkshire, we have the council's chief executive who attends the board meeting, sees a member, and we have the council's director of finance who can attend as an observer, and that gives a very high level of accountability and scrutiny in addition to the regular performance reports which mirror largely what was going on pre the integration of culture into the trust which we now have.
Mr Campbell, neither the chief executive or director of finance are elected members. It's not exactly democratic accountability.
Well, in addition to the elected members that are there, there's a high level of scrutiny which goes on.
I think we were talking about democratic accountability.
Sorry, you're
I'm
right.
not sure that's quite the same thing.
Well, there are also, in addition to that, 3 other elected members, and there is a high level of scrutiny that goes on in addition to that.
Neil Finlay?
I think in the answer to Claire Adamson, we got to the nub of this discussion, because for most onlookers, a rates scam and a VAT scam and some clever accountancy would result in people being accused of corporate tax evasion. And that's what this is. It's simple. It is tax avoidance schemes in order to have some financial benefit or some financial gain. And the answer to Claire Adamson was correct, that had this loophole not existed, you wouldn't be sitting here discussing this, because it would never happen. And I think probably for successive governments, it's been convenient for us to have this, because they're actually, within the current government, at Westminster in particular, I'm sure that they would like to see many more services externalised and taken down this route. But I just want to pick up on a comment that Mr Campbell made about staff freedom and flexibility and innovation and all that type of thing. Is that not an argument for reforming the management of the local authority rather than an argument for externalising or changing the structure of service?
Well, it may be, as I said, I wasn't managing the staff that are transferred over. They're in there now, there may well be. I think my experience of 25 years of public service would say that managing 1,200 people in an organisation is and can be an easier task than literally 10 to 15,000 people. And we're a smaller organisation where we've got tighter controls, shorter management spans in terms of how we deal with people. I'm giving you the evidence and the experience that we've got in South Lanarkshire in terms of how it works. It may well be there's some issues there, but for us it works. It has worked very well.
So if we take that principle further, is that an argument then for housing to go, for social work, for other council services to go down that route? Is that, if the principle that you're saying is correct, then is that an argument for those services going down the same route?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't be able to comment on what goes on in those other areas. That's not my background. But my background is in managing, first of all, sports facilities, extended those practices, and this is what staff are saying. This is the evidence that we've got with staff. We're not done. I qualified it by saying we're not doing anything radically different. This is just about people who are there, are feeling a bit more engaged, and they're contributing a bit more, and there's evidence in terms of some small increases in the uptake and the uses of the services.
In terms of just in other financial areas, is there any issues arising in terms of the way that the trusts are funded more generally? We'll take out the tax avoidance issue, but in terms of how grants are provided, is there any issues coming up there, or is that system largely the same in all authorities?
I mean, one issue that we've had that we highlighted in our evidence was that many of the business cases for the establishment of trusts point to external funding being available and trusts not being able to access that funding whilst under local authority control. I'm not sure that the evidence of how trusts have accessed external funding would back up these statements, particularly in many of the cases where the funding that was highlighted as not being available was in fact able to be accessed when they were in local authority control. So I think there needs to be a bit more work done on how trusts have accessed that external funding that was a very, very key part of their business case in the first place.
Are we talking private funding, or are we talking lottery funding, or
combination? I would think. Yeah.
It's primarily lottery funding. I mean, there are two arguments. I try and put both of them. Sporter would argue that it's unlocked about 400 million investment in leisure facilities through access to national heritage lottery funding and other sources. But the Audit Commission, in their report, found there was no evidence that leisure trusts generated significant external funding. And there are problems with leisure trusts accessing investments, particularly where it's an annual grant, because banks won't necessarily lend unless there's certainty of funding that goes forward. So there are difficulties. One of the advantages leisure trusts have had is they've been able to use, where there's been savings on NNDR, that has enabled the leisure trust to invest more in terms of refurbishment of facilities. But longer term, there are issues around the sustainability of that. And despite some improvements in leisure provision and leisure facilities, we've still got a largely ageing stock that's in need of significant investment.
Briefly, Claire Adamson.
Yeah, it was just don't want to be misrepresented in where that question was coming from. I guess what I want to ask is do you think enough emphasis is put on the advantages to the community and the improved service and the improved morale? Do you think that gets a high enough profile in local government as opposed to just the financial issues in the relationship?
Celebrate success and where things have got better, and there's evidence to back that up. I think we could all do much more to share that and share what that practice has been. That's certainly something we're having a look at to see how we could try and do that. But it has to be seen in the context of all the other kind of issues and challenges I think that management have got whenever they're managing services on a day-to-day basis. But I think certainly I would recognise that I think there's more could go on there.
I think locally where there's been a positive experience in development of trusts, local authorities have continued to roll out the trust model, and I think that the rationale for doing that is not solely one of financial benefit. It's based on feedback that they're getting from their communities, from their service users, and the evidence that there is of delivery against wider outcomes.
I was going, just to finish, it's a question that Mr Finlay just asked, but I want to ask it again effectively, because it was certainly something that was bothering me, was if it's such a success financially and you know, cuts staff absence and improves morale and lots of other good stuff, is there anything to stop local authorities from rolling out this trust model across their other departments?
I mean, local authorities have statutory functions that they have to carry out. Over and above that, I mean, we have seen outsourcing, privatisation, charitable status trusts being created. There is a whole agenda. There is a whole agenda there that, in this current climate, nearly every local authority up and down the country is looking very closely at. So there is very much an issue about local authority providing local public services, because the financial climate is driving that agenda for us at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think there are three things that local authorities are currently looking at in terms of the financial challenges. One is efficiencies, one is service reduction, and one is there a better way or a different kind of delivery model that's going to help us face these challenges, which is not quite the same as everything kind of going out to trust. And I think that those local authorities, the higher performing local authorities, go through that process and would apply the best value test to that. But it is true that there are other council services where that's been looked at. I mean, for example, another wider example I'm aware of is around waste management, for example. So it is happening.
I'd say no, because it's quite specific to leisure and culture, and the financial advantages in terms of the tax system. The only point I'd make, local authorities did not invent the tax system. The fact that they've taken advantage of it in difficult financial circumstances is a pragmatic response to the circumstances they face. But I don't see the application of the leisure trust model in social work or necessarily waste management. There are models of social enterprise that kind of work in, but it's a different approach than the leisure trust.
Sorry, Mr. Finlay,
No, just briefly. I mean, the convener was asking if there's anything to stop, you know, authorities going down that route. I think there is, because we saw it in Edinburgh recently. Mr. Blackwell, I'm sure, will confirm, with the proposal to take quite a number of services down that route. And the thing that stopped it was public outcry and a massive campaign by the trade unions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the point that Mark makes is correct as well, in as much as the model for leisure trust might not be appropriate for some of the other services, but there are other drivers there, whether that be privatisation, outsourcing, or whatever.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Can I thank all of you for attending this morning? It's been a very useful session and very informative. And can I suspend very briefly before we move on to the next item on the agenda? Thank you. Can I move on now to agenda item 3? Next item on this morning's agenda is consideration of a negative statutory instrument. No motion to annul has been lodged in respect of the instrument, and the Subordinate Legislation Committee determined that did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument. Can I ask members if they have any comments? Mr Finlay?
Yeah, I think there is an issue with this. We have quite a bit of representation from constituents on this in terms of the removal of the ILAs from graduates, and we really have some difficulty supporting this because the people we're contacting are in particular people who have graduated some time ago. Maybe there's a career change or there's new requirements on them to do certain qualifications, and the ILA was assisting them in that. And I actually think this is a backward step.
Liam McCarthy?
Probably related to that slightly in that looking at the explanatory note the officials have provided, talks about the financial effects and suggests that no impact assessment was necessary as the instrument has no financial effects on Scottish Government, local government or on business. I mean, certainly I appreciate the first two of those, but I suspect that if ILAs are being more specifically targeted in particular areas, I suspect there'll be certain businesses or certain sectors that may be impacted by this either positively or negatively, whether through people reskilling and going back into particular professions. I mean, it's not necessarily a reason for holding this up, but it'd be helpful to know what, if any, assessment's been done about the likely impact on different sectors.
Anybody else? Any comments?
Could say maybe just to be helpful.
Okay.
One of the other areas where people are commenting on is in terms of the new arrangements for people who are required to get new qualifications for childcare provision, and they've been the ILAs have been being used in that regard as well.
Okay. Sorry, Claire, did you want to say something?
Just to say that it's would be great if we could continue to fund everything, but under the circumstances, I think it's absolutely right to be targeting this at low paid and low skilled people that are out with the workforce at the moment.
Okay, well, I mean, this obviously, sorry, anybody else? No. I think the main point here is this: there has been no motion to annul, so technically I have to put the question to the committee, which is, does the committee agree to make no recommendation to the Parliament on SSI 2012-172? No. Well, I mean, there is no motion to annul, so effectively...
Unless we put a motion in where we're agreed.
Yeah.
And can we record the dissent?
There's no formal division, but you can record you can state your dissent there, but there's no formal division.
Well, I mean, there is no formal, as I say, vote as such, given there's no motion to annul, but I'm quite happy for you to put that on the record if you so would now wish.
Yeah, I would record the dissent in the absence of a motion being put forward.
One second, Neil? Okay.
Just to say that it's been there since the end of May, so it's a bit, I'm just a bit confused as to why this should be coming now rather than
well, I mean,
the time's been given.
Members, obviously, I mean, I don't know that, but I mean, effectively, you're right. I think it was the 31st of May this was laid, and members have had since then to ask questions or submit a motion to annul. That hasn't happened. So, given that situation, then I will, given the comments that both Neils have made, I'll just reiterate the question: does the committee agree to make no recommendation to the Parliament on SSI 2012-172? Thank you. As the committee has agreed to hold the next items in private, I now close the meeting to the public.